All right, so here we are. So I would like to discuss for you the relationship between science and art, and to offer perhaps a more cautionary view that is usually presented. First, let me tell you that if you want to have more details on these views, unfortunately most of it is in French. What are we talking about? Oh, all right. So here's a small book which I wrote 2 years ago. Unfortunately, as I said, it's only in French. And this is a quarterly review, which is called Alliage, Alloy. The subtitle, as you can see, is Culture, Science and Technique. We are publishing this, we have been publishing this for 25 years, and it's a review where scientists, artists, writers, philosophers, social scientists, and so on, meet and exchange. Now, let me back to the theme of my talk. The point is that science and art is much too wide a theme to be discussed in general. There's something which is missing here. It's much too general in scope, because you could ask which sciences, mathematics, physics, natural sciences, social sciences. You could ask which arts. Do we deal with music, literature, painting, sculpture? It's also much too wide in space and time, because we could ask when and where. Do we deal with the situation in Europe, in China, in Japan, India, America, and with ancient times, medieval, modern times? The reason why I'm saying this, that this relationship between science and art has been very different according to the places and time, as I'll try to show you by a few examples. The first example, of course, is well known. It's a very close relationship between geometry and perspective in the European Renaissance, which is illustrated by a very famous painting by Piero della Francesca, which is also illustrated by a book by Albrecht Dürer, who was at the same time a book for painters and a geometry treatise, which is most interesting still today. Well, this is very well known and shows that at that time, in some sense, there is no deep difference between science and art. Artists and scientists very often are exactly of the same kind, they do the same job, and if you could look at a somewhat later period, let's say the beginning of the 17th century, I could show to you that somebody like Galileo was a very good physicist because he was also a good writer, a good painter, and a good musician. Now that is a closed period, unfortunately. Let me give you another example which is much less known. It's the case of the Japanese sangaku. Sangaku are votive tablets which you can find in Japanese temples, and they deal with mathematics. When you go in a Japanese temple, of course, you see a lot of these votive tablets. Most of them are illustrated with very nice paintings of the Fuji-san, or horses, or the sea, and so on and so on. But a few of them, dating back to the 18th century, still in the 19th century, and a few still again in the 20th century, deal with mathematical problems. Here is some illustration. This is a small countryside temple, and if you look closely at these votive tablets, you can see something like that, which show you geometrical figures with all sorts of explanations underneath, which prove some rather sophisticated geometrical theorems. Here is another one still. So you have these geometrical figures, and you have all sorts of mathematical statements here. That's something which is very strange for us. We don't think usually of going into a church or a temple and to see some mathematical ex votos. And it has to do, of course, but I can't go into the details, with the very strange context of the Japanese culture at that time. This was the Edo period of the Japanese culture. That is a time from the 17th to the end of the 19th century, where Japan was completely isolated. Nobody went out, nobody came in, and they developed a lot of very specific cultural works, including a cultural relationship in mathematics, which is, in these votive tablets, mathematics is offered to the gods, the kamis, is offered to the gods as something which is beautiful, like they could do with a horse on a mountain and so on and so on. So, in fact, as I said, science and art is much too wide a theme. There is no universal relationship between science and art, which means that I will concentrate on a more specific place and time and subject. Namely, I will deal mostly with exact sciences, so-called exact sciences. If I have time, I will show to you they are much less exact than usually thought. There is mathematics, physics, and fine arts, this painting or sculpture, plastic arts, as we say, today. We will not go back to the earlier period which I just alluded to. Now, why are we speaking of art and science today? This has been already said in some detail by Roger Malina in his talk. In fact, it's a contemporary buzzword, as we all know. You have many conferences, including this one, exhibitions, writings, and so on and so on. And the main idea behind these common grounds is that there are similarities, convergences, analogies between artists and scientists, supposedly both being creators. If you ask yourself why this renewal of relationship or potential relationship between scientists and artists, it seems to me there is a double purpose which is an implicit one, and I will try to make it explicit. First, on the scientific side, the idea is to bridge the gap between scientific knowledge and public understanding through artistic mediation and to counter the defiance against science considered as purely utilitarian or dangerous. Of course, we know today there are strong anti-science movements because of pollution, atomic weapons, and so on and so on. And it is clear that some scientists, at least, are looking to a relationship with the arts and humanities in order to have, let's say, a better image in the eyes of the public. On the artistic side, it seems to me that very often the idea is to put art in the context of our technological society by letting it share the aura of scientific efficiency. And if you consider these two purposes, it's quite clear they are rather inconsistent with one another, which is the reason why I'm offering discussion review, which I will develop. I will start with a rather critical overview of what I call some questionable attempts to bridge the gap between science and art. The first idea, and there are many examples of it, are to look at science as an artistic experience. That is, trying to find within science, and mostly within the pictures it offers, something which could be called artistic. Let me give you the following example. It's an exhibition put forward by the INSERM. INSERM is the Institution for Scientific Research in Health and Medical Research in France. And they have a traveling exhibition with posters like this one. These posters being done with photographs taken from the laboratory work, but treated in false colors, of course, and given some very fancy titles. For instance, I don't know if you can look at, can read that. This is called Le Chanteur de Jazz, the jazz singer, probably because of this mouth, which seems to be open. Of course, it has nothing to do either with jazz or singing. These are just biological cells, and there is a metaphor here which personally I don't find very interesting or appealing. Few other examples, always of the same kind. This is also a cell, this is biology, and it is called black hole, which is a concept taken from astronomy. There is no connection whatever between this black cell and a black hole in astronomy. Some other ones. So it seems to me that examples are not very helpful, and quite on the contrary, they could give the impression that scientists are trying to get a beautiful picture, which is not the case. As I told you, these scientific pictures are treated in false colors. In the lab, this is not what you are looking at, this is not what you are studying. You are doing it in a supposedly more aesthetically appealing form, just for the general public, which means that in some sense, you are cheating the public, because you are not showing it the true scientific pictures, which are much less appealing than they seem to look here, but much more interesting, of course. A second example is taken from the US. It's an annual contest, which is called Art of Science, and scientists are called to send for the contest the most beautiful, many quotation marks, the most beautiful picture they have. And this is what you get. So it is pretty, if you want. It is nice, if you want. Is it art? I strongly doubt it. Third example, which is well known, so these pictures of fractals, which were very fashionable a few years ago, a bit less nowadays. And here again, by treating them in false colors, they are supposed to take some aesthetic appeal. What I can say about this attempt is the following cautionary word: beware of technocage. This seems to me exactly what it is. You are exploiting scientific pictures just to brighten your eye, but I think there is no real deep artistic content behind it. Now, another argument in the same way, that is trying to find some scientific experience within science, has to do with a theme which I will not be able to develop as long as I would like to, which is the idea of the beauty of science. Is there some beauty in science? Many scientists have said so. And I give you just one quotation, but I have dozens of them. This is by a great mathematician, which is called Jean-Marc Le vy-Leblond, the beginning of the 20th century. He said, wrote, "In my work, I have always attempted to ally truth and beauty," with capitals, you'll notice. Truth with big T and beauty with big B. And when I had to choose one against the other, I have most often chosen beauty. This is a very strong statement by a scientist, which if I am forced to choose between truth and beauty, I choose beauty. Of course, this is not what he does. When you look closely at his work, what he calls beauty is what he knows to be true. So he doesn't have to choose between truth and beauty. What kind of beauty is that? Well, I do not deny that when mathematicians or physicists are working in their lab, they find some aesthetic feelings towards the content of their work and even towards the form of their work. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But this kind of beauty to me is not artistic beauty, it's more like craftsmanship beauty. A nice tool which is well adapted to its use, you can consider it as beautiful. And when scientists look at their theories or equations or whatever, of course these are very well polished and very useful tools. In that sense, they can be said to be beautiful, but you see that this has very little to do with the wide notion of beauty in general. And in fact, these statements of this kind, you could find, as I said, a large number of them, but mostly in the work of physicists or mathematicians. Why? Well, because they work with simple words, simplified words. An atom is something which is very simple, even if it's very hard to understand, but it's a small piece of matter which is much simpler than any macroscopic piece of matter. And when they do that, they are able to find some rather elegant and aesthetic descriptions or theories. Now, if you ask the same question, is your science beautiful, to people dealing with life sciences, to biologists, they will not say so. They could say that nature is beautiful, but that's something completely different, a different question which I will not discuss here. But if you ask them, is your science beautiful? Usually they will say no. Why? Because it's too complicated. Understanding a cell, understanding a virus, understanding the behavior of a living being is a mess, really. And you never have the very elegant theoretical structures which you can find in mathematics or physics. And it's no surprise that one of the best answers to this kind of statement and rejoinder was given by a biologist, namely Thomas Huxley, who was a friend of Darwin, and who wrote, "The great tragedy of science is the mother of splendid theories by sordid facts." Indeed, when you do a complicated science, like biology, or even more, of course, social sciences, you have all sorts of facts, very complicated, if not completely solid, which means that it's very difficult and even perhaps impossible to have these splendid theories. Last remark, anyway, modern art is not any more centrally concerned with beauty, but perhaps sometimes with ugliness, and is rather concerned with meaning. So any appeal to the idea of beauty in science, to my mind, is unable to answer the question of a deep relationship between science and art. And to end up with this question, let me give you an example, more specific than the beauty of science, but I alluded to already, the beauty of equations. Physicists can tell you, my equation is really beautiful. I'm very pleased with this equation. And some artists have tried to put this into perspective. For instance, Bernard Venet, in a work of 2001, did this painting, which is just an exact reproduction. Well, not a completely exact, because he made quite a number of errors in copying it, which already tells you something, which is that the mathematical contents of this is empty because of 2 or 3 simple mistakes. But he does that on this deep blue screen, this very symmetrical structure. Of course, he does not understand what this means. Neither do I. Even as a theoretical physicist, this is an appeal to very highbrow mathematics, which only a handful of mathematicians could understand and agree on the possible beauty of it. And to prove my point, or trying to prove it, let me do an experiment. I will show you 3 equations. I will ask you which is the most beautiful. First one you know, of course. E equal mc squared, Einstein, energy mass, and so on. Second one is this, sometimes a bit more complicated. And third one is this. Now let's take a vote. Who is in favor of the first one? Okay. The second? Okay. The third? It's always the same result. The second one wins. Not by much, but it was. Or the second one is not an equation of physics. The first one is, this is relativity. The third one is, this is Schrödinger equation, which rules the behavior of electrons in an atom. The second one is just completely invented out of nothing. Just play. I just played with symbols in order to have something which is kind of nice, right? But it has no meaning, which means that this beauty of equations, I do not deny that it exists and has some meaning in the mind of physicists and mathematicians, theoreticians, but it cannot be transmitted unless you really go inside the science itself, unless you really understand what it means. As I said, it's the beauty of a nice tool and nothing more. A second questionable attempt is to try to use science as art critic. One example, bad example, is an exhibition which was put forward at the University of Strasbourg 10 years ago about Paul Klee, as you can see, Paul Klee, Entre art et science, between art and science. And this exhibition showed in the gardens of the university quite a number of reproductions of Klee's work with comments written by scientists who were supposed to find in the works by Klee some scientific resonance. Now, just an example. This is a painting by Paul Klee with a comment by a mineralogist who writes, Paul Klee has been one of the few artists to introduce crystallographic notion in the artistic dimension, which is plainly wrong. His work bears witness to a three-dimensional vision of macroscopic element and the wish to reach universality. If you can make it, any meaning out of this, you will have to explain it to me. It seems to me this is just empty words trying to just to put science in this context. Another recent example, which is more interesting on the, let's say, how could I say, perhaps on the scientific side, is a study of Pollock's grid painting using the theory, mathematical theory of fractals, and trying to show that there is a fractal dimension in Pollock's art with, you can see here, mathematical graphics, very complicated. Of course, this does not give us the slightest element in order to appreciate Pollock as an artist or a painter. At best, it could be used technically, perhaps, to distinguish true Pollock's painting from bad copies. But as you can see, this is certainly this certainly does not clarify the artistic content. No, I think there is a deep reason for being cautious in trying to bridge together artists and scientists. And this deep reason is that they are very different from one another. They do very different jobs. To say of both that they are creators is true, but trivial. Trivial in that there are many other sorts of creators, hopefully, within humanity. I don't know, somebody who, a big perfumer or a cook or somebody who, how do you say, couturier, somebody who do. Yes. He is somebody who is really creative. There are all sorts of fields of activity. All the activity fields of humanity need creation and have creators. So you can say artists and scientists are creators, all right, but okay. Now let us look more closely to the relationship between artists and scientists from different point of view. Look at their activity. I will be a bit sketchy. You will excuse me for being somewhat caricatural, but I try to go to the essence of what I am saying. The activity of an artist is mostly individual. Most artists are working by themselves, and quite a number are working really alone in their studio. On the contrary, scientists have a collective activity which has become wider and wider with the times. I don't know if you are aware that, for instance, the discovery of the Higgs boson was alluded to this morning. The article in which the discovery of the Higgs boson is published, a scientific journal, is signed by several hundreds of people, several hundreds authors for a single article. Which means that the signature has no meaning, of course. When you have a car which is going out of a factory, it is not signed by all the workers and engineers who have collaborated to produce it. So perhaps not in all, but in most scientific domain today, the production is a collective activity in which the role of each individual is very difficult to single out. Now, let's consider the social status. The artist has a personal status. He's working as a liberal craftsmanship, while the scientist works in an institutional context. He gets a salary, which is not the case for most artists, of course, which means that there is a big difference, deep difference in their economic status. The assessment of the work, is it good, is it bad, is it interesting, is it not interesting, in art is due to the singular difference of the work. If an artist does the same thing as another that has no interest, or just is considered a secondary one, which is a follower of a main line. So the idea is that art is valuable in proportion to its original creativity. This is not the case in science, where the assessment is quite on the contrary, an assessment of normative conformity. Your work as a scientist is recognized if it's roughly the same as what the other do. You have to follow the same rules, you have to use the same paradigms, so to say, unless you're a genius, and then you're able to transcend these norms and to do something else. But there are very few geniuses, and there are many scientists. So most scientists are just following the way, and they do what they are supposed to do, which is not a critique by itself, just means that they are not so much, to come back to the idea, in some sense, creators perhaps not so much as producers, which is not exactly the same thing. The recognition of an artist is first of all external. He has to be recognized by the critics and by public exhibitions. His work has to be bought by the public. If he's just working in his studio, he will get no recognition. Quite on the contrary, for scientists, recognition is internal. You get recognition from your peers in specialized publications, and perhaps you get famous after a while if the communication staff of your institution puts you forward. But that's something completely different. The economy of art and the economy of science are completely different also. The economy of artists, I've already said, it's an economy of craftsmanship. The artist sells his work a posteriori. Here I am a bit sketchy because, of course, you have also you can have orders from the state or from rich people, but that's rather exceptional cases. While for scientists, they work in a factory-like spirit. They are paid a priori for doing the work they will do. Nobody has waited for the scientists at CERN to find the Higgs boson to pay their salary. So it's very different. And finally, the financial scale of both works is here again completely different. Commercial artists work on a commercial scale from hundreds to millions dollars. The billion is the point where science starts nowadays. an interesting scientific experiment easily costs $1 million and can go to billions, as it is the case for the experiments here again to find the Higgs boson. So this leads me to ask the following question. When you consider artists via scientists, is the question one of collaboration, or would not it be more interesting to speak about their confrontation, that is, starting from the differences in order to establish links? I can tell you, if somebody tries to prove to me that after all an artist is doing more or less the same thing as I do as a scientist, I would say, well, I am not interested. I know what I'm doing. I do not need, if he does the same thing, why should I go and see about it? It's just because it is very different that I am interested. So this means confronting different activities, different views of the world, and I will try to, in the second part of this talk, I will try to give you a few examples. I end this, let's say, critical part by a caveat which I have not much time to develop, which is the following. Science is not technology. Of course, today they tend to be very close together, as science tends to fecund technology. But the spirit of technology, doing things, is not the same as the spirit of science, understanding things. Which means that when you see an artist using, that's all right with me, I have absolutely no quarrel with it. When an artist is using modern technologies, electronic, computer science, whatever, for his work, that's no problem if the work is interesting. But this is no guarantee that there is any scientific content or interest in his work. There is a very big difference in the use of a technology and the relationship with the fundamental science, with the ideas, with the knowledge which is behind. Now, let me propose a rather modest view of what I find the interesting type of relationship between scientists and artists. This is what I call brief encounters. I don't know how many of you have seen a beautiful film, 60 years old, by David Lean, which is called Brief Encounter. Who knows Brief Encounter? Nobody. Perhaps a few people. It's a beautiful film. I can recommend it to you. A very romantic film. Fisher was asking for romantic views. It's a film which tells about the story of a man and a woman who meet in a railway station. He's a doctor, small doctor in a small town, and she's an office employee. So common people, really. And they just meet when they take the train together in the morning when they go to the work, and something happens between them, which will be very brief, will never be achieved. They will never meet together, they will never sleep together, nothing, and they will separate after a few days of these brief encounters, but they will have been, both of them will have been very much moved and transformed by this brief encounter. Now, this to me is the kind of model of what I hope when I encounter an artist. I know that he's doing his work and doing my work. But if we can have a brief encounter in which we can exchange some ideas, some points of view, and be changed by this exchange, and then each one goes back to his work with a slightly different outlook, this is all right for me. So let me give you a few examples taken here from my own personal experience of such brief encounters. which may play different roles. The first one is art for science assessment and critique. I mean by that some artists helped me to understand what is science, what is its history, what is its philosophy. And let me give you a very simple example. It's the work of David Bueno, who calls himself a Neoplatonician copist. Can recommend to you, he has a beautiful site on the web, very nice. One of his work has consisted in exploring the big libraries, big old libraries all around the world to find copies of the Euclid Elements, this first very deep work of mathematics of ancient Greece, through the ages, and to compare the pictures in all of these copies, whether they be in Greek, in Arabic, in Chinese, and so on and so on. And the idea is the following. Of course, in some sense, it's the same mathematics. This is a picture which is supposed to help proving the Pythagoras theorem. But never mind. Of course, the same Pythagoras theorem, but is it really the same? If the figures are somewhat different, if the text is written in different characters, do we really deal with the same theorem? In some sense, yes, its mathematical essence is the same, but its cultural outlook, the way it takes place in the language, in the times, is different, in fact. And this is what David Bueno helps us in understanding, with also the secondary benefit that it shows to us that sometimes some of these graphs are very badly copied, and some of them are plainly wrong, but that's something else. And he has done a gigantic work, because each of these drawings is accompanied by a small notice, which you are told from which library it comes, the author, and so on and so on. And this helps to give me a complete sense of the history of science. It is not sufficient to understand the history of science, to have dates and names, to know how really it happened within a given culture. You need to see the paper, the picture, the ink, the characters, and to relate it to the outside cultural world. Now, a second example is a young French artist, which is called David Lachavanne, and who puts into question the idea of measurement. As you can see, he shows, I don't know if you see this, but this is a ruler, a gigantic ruler, which is not straight. Here again. And this, to me, physicists ask a very interesting question. Why do we use straight rulers? And how do we know they are straight? And this is a deep epistemological question, in fact. Fisher alluded to it this morning. You know that physicists today, following Einstein, are using curved space, whatever that means. And so the idea of curved rulers and complicated ways of taking measurements is a very interesting way of looking at things. And then you have some very simple artwork which asks the question, doesn't answer it, of course, but it asks it in concrete terms. This Emmanuel Lejean, also a young French artist. You could think, if I was not telling you that it is an artistic work, that these are pictures of astronomy, of course, and the name of these works are astronomical names. And what Lejean says, of course, the idea behind his work is the idea that we should not be fooled by the, again, quotation marks, beautiful aspects of so many astronomical pictures. Beautiful colors, bright, and so on and so on. What does that mean if we do not understand really what is shown on these pictures? We should not be fooled just by the colors. An artist can do as beautiful a galaxy as an astronomer, unless the fact that it is not a galaxy. In fact, in a secondary idea, I would just to mention to you that the way Région works is a very interesting one. It has nothing to do with science, just a question of art. Contrary to what you might think, he does not proceed in putting first black, what do you say, couche, black cover, does not cover first his canvas in black and then add red and then add yellow. In fact, there's just the contrary. He starts by putting an overall yellow, then an overall green, an overall red, then an overall black, and then he erases the color successively. That's a very interesting way to paint. He paints by removing material instead of adding material. End of the parenthesis. I don't know if you can see anything here because perhaps the contrast is not very good. Here you can see perhaps a bit more. So you have some white specks, spots on these black pictures, not photographs. And of course, the idea here again is that this has something to do with astronomy. You could think that these are astronomical pictures. In fact, it's the work of John Fontcuberta, who is a Catalan artist, very ironical, very humoristic, and in his work he's making fun of these astronomical pictures, because what you see here is in fact a picture of the windshield of his car after a summer night when all the insects have been crashed on the windshield of the car. And so this is not a comet, it's just a poor insect which gets exploded and crashing on the windshield. So this is a way by the artist of taking some recoil, going back and asking us what is this picture you are looking at? How can you interpret it if you are not really a scientist? The last aspect is perhaps a deeper one, is art as a source for what I call experimental epistemology. Epistemology, most of the time, is thought of as a theoretical work in philosophy of science. I think it is interesting to consider what I call this experimental epistemology, that is trying to have a concrete approach to the ideas, concepts, notions behind scientific work. Let me start with the work by François Morellet, which is a very simple work, typical of the 80s. This is a grass taken in the field, which is just put on a canvas, and Morellet draws some lines here which go along the directions of these small leaves here. In other terms, he uses an element taken from the natural world, the grass, to give structure, abstract structure, to the canvas itself. He uses that nature to extrapolate, to extract this structure from nature. But when I see that, and when I try to think what it means, well, it reminds me of my work as a physicist. This is exactly what I do. I'm looking at an atom or at a star or whatever, and what interests me is not so much the object as such, but rather the abstract structures I am able to extract from the object. I am able, by looking at the star, to understand the phenomena which are going inside and outside the star, and not just to be stuck looking at the object itself. Science consists in extracting ideas, structures from the objects and not only in looking at the objects or picturing them. A second example by Morellet also interests me very much. As is really minimal art at its most minimal, I could say, tires, small line, if you prefer, small lines, the length and spacing of which are augmented at each row by 5 millimeters. That's the program of the work. That is what Morellet does. He does the small lines, and the second row they are a bit higher and a bit more spaced, and so on and so on. Which is simplistic, of course. Now, what is interesting in this picture is that if I just gave you the program, and I tell you, I don't show you the work, don't show you the canvas, and I tell you, this is how the work is done, try to imagine it in your mind. I'm sure that almost no one among you would imagine that you will have these curved structures appearing. This is something which goes beyond the program itself. The program itself produces something which is much more complicated. I'm not telling you about beauty or so, that's not the question here. The question is the question of the interest. The program does not tell you that we have something rather sophisticated and unexpected which arrives. And here again, I think about my work and I say, all right, this is what I would like to call meaningful oversimplification, which is the following. Most of the time, if I have to study, let's say, an atom, molecule, large body, it's very, very complicated, and I am not sure that the theories I use, the concepts I am relying on, will be sufficient to give me something interesting. So what I'm trying to do is to make simplistic, oversimplistic sometimes models. For instance, instead of studying a phenomenon in the 3 dimensions of space, I pretend to myself that space is one-dimensional, just a line. And I try to see what the ideas and theories which I want to use will produce in such a situation. If they produce something interesting, just like that, I will say, well, all right, it's worthwhile going on and trying to apply these ideas and concepts to more complicated and more realistic situations. But I start most of the time by oversimplifying the program I am trying to study. Another example which I like very much is the one by Giovanni Anselmo, who is one of the best artists of the arte povera movement of the 70s and 80s. And it's a very small work, so it's 2 pieces of lead, as you can see, a few centimeters in their dimensions, just separated by this interval. And on one of them is printed the word visible. The title of the work is invisible, because of course I think that almost nobody can help not to read in this small space. That is, you have here a situation where the void, the vacuum which is here, is not, it's a vacuum, but it is not empty. It is charged with a meaning which is given to it by its surroundings. It is the 2 pieces of lead and the word printed here which help us understanding what is in here. Now that's also a situation which I know well as a physicist, and this helps me in understanding it beyond the equations, formalism, and so on and so on. This is what I call interpolation or boundary conditions, which I can explain in the following way as a physicist. If I want to know what is the the intensity of light at any point in this room, here or here, so on and so on. Knowing the theory of light, the equations of electromagnetism, it is sufficient to know the intensity of light on the walls, ceilings, and floor. It is sufficient for me to know exactly the intensity of light on the boundaries of this room, to be able to compute what is going on at each point within the room. So you see that the space within the room, as far as the intensity of light is concerned, is completely ruled, determined by these boundary conditions. Here's something which physicists do all the time, because it's too complicated to know or to measure at each point in the room, but it's sufficient to know what's going on the walls and ceiling. Another example from also somebody from the Arte Povera movement, Giovanni Anselmo, and here the point is that the picture is really insufficient to transmit the idea I would like to transmit. It's called verso oltre mare because of the small blue square which is here, which I will disregard completely. I will not discuss that. What interests me is this slab of stone. It's a big slab of stone. It's 3 meters high. It's 3 meters high, and what you cannot really see here, it does not lie against the wall. It is just in equilibrium, oblique equilibrium, and it holds in equilibrium just because of this small cable which is here and the way it is on the floor. Now when you see this piece of work in the exhibition, and you are just a side of it, 3 meters high, you are, at least I hope you are, and I am, at least, I am very much afraid. Because this weighs a few hundred kilograms, and I tell myself, well, how can it stay without falling? Then, as a physicist, I say, oh, all right, but I could do a calculation. It's not too hard. I can evaluate the weight of this slab. I can evaluate the resistance of the cable, the forces of friction on the floor, and by writing a few equations, I can satisfy myself and convince myself that, all right, it is stable. I'm still afraid, even if I do the calculation. And that means that I have a tendency as a physicist, most physicists have, towards, and this is of course crucial for their job, a tendency to abstractify the world, to reduce the concrete pieces of the world to the interplay of letters on the blackboard or on the paper, forces, I write equations and so on and so on. But if I do not take a step back, I will be prisoner of this abstraction. And I need that something else happens in the world to tell me, all right, your equations, that's very good, but do not forget that you are dealing not with forces as abstract mathematical concept, but as forces as real threats and dangers which are around you. Do not forget the real world which is behind your equation. In other terms, a movement of disabstraction which is offered to me by such pieces of art. Another one, in the same spirit, this is one of Piotr Kowalski, who, by the way, was a great artist of the 70s and 80s. He died by the end of the century, and he was really trained as an engineer in the States at the MIT. He had a very deep understanding of physics and mathematics, but he was an artist by himself. He was not prisoner of his formation. And he made a very simple word. This is, how do you say, stamp? This is a small stamp. You can have it done wherever you want. It will not cost very much. The work of art is very easy to copy, which tells you this is moving at 29.9 kilometers per second. This, what? This. Everything around you. You can put this stamp on this table, on this computer, on the floor, on your arm. We are all moving at 29.9 kilometers per second around the sun. 29 kilometers per second, 30 kilometers per second. The time I pronounce one single sound, we have made 3 kilometers. And we do not feel it, of course. So, since Galileo's time, we have learned why we do not feel it. This was a great objection to the idea, of course, of heliocentrism. If the Earth is moving, how comes we do not feel it? Well, this was explained by science. We take it for granted today, but still, I think it's very interesting, very important to remind us of this fact, which is puzzling. We move at 30 kilometers per second. So it's what I would call the sensorialization of ideas due to sense. I am almost through. Last, art as an inspiration for scientific ethics. We give you 2 examples and I'm finished. First one is the work of Giuseppe Pennone, great Italian artist. It's called Ripetere il bosco, to repeat the wood. You could think that you have small pieces of wood trees which are put on these pieces of wood beams, but not. In fact, the work of Pennone consists in taking a beam, construction beam, and to find within the beam the small tree which it was many years ago. Which means even when you have an artifact, a completely artificial, industrial piece of matter, do not forget that once it was living, it was a living being. The small tree still persists within the dead beam which is there. And that, to me, is a very strong lesson today, because you know that science has to face many ethical issues, specifically in the life sciences, and trying to remember and to remind the scientists that life is life, like a rabbit. When you look at it, once he is dead, right, but once he was living. And so you have to be very careful with that. Same lesson, respecting life, taken from Joseph Beuys in a performance of 65, in which for 3 days he carries on his shoulders dead hair with these big metals things and the lead shoes. So he's overwhelmed by the weight of this dead animal. He's feeling the responsibility, even perhaps the guilt, which is linked to that. So here again, the lesson is to respect life. And now, my last few words, coming back to the general argument of this conference, the question was, towards a third culture. And I think that before answering this, there are 2 prejudicial questions to be asked. First, is there really a scientific culture? Which supposedly would be the second one. I doubt it very seriously, as Roger Malena before me. I do not think that today there is a scientific culture, even and first of all within science itself. Most scientists are completely ignorant of their history, of their philosophy, of the surrounding cultural context. They are doing quite an interesting work. They are good scientists, they have no culture, no longer any culture. Second traditional question, can there really be several cultures? I doubt it also. You know that the French Republic is characterized by the fact that it claims itself to be une et indivisible, one and indivisible. I think the same can be said for culture. If you had different cultures, they would not be cultures. Culture is specified by the fact that it links together the many facets of human activity. I do not think you can separate, let's say, literary culture from artistic culture, from musical culture, and for scientific culture. So, to me, the idea of all these discussions, which are welcome and very useful, in fact, is not so much the idea of going towards a third culture, but rather to go towards a new and single culture. But perhaps this is just wishful thinking. Who knows? Thank you, Pam.